project management has undergone a major breakthrough in recent times. Since its genesis, as a formal management faculty in the early 1930s and 40s, today, one can see three distinct generations of project management tools. In this video, we will look at the three generations in greater detail.
The first generation is sometimes referred to as traditional project management. In this generation, the focus was on being able to define project management as a profession, as opposed to what it was before that. It was merely an extension of general management. Therefore, the first generation was looking at how one could bring in this concept of project management into the real world. In doing so, the focus was on understanding basic concepts and seeing how these concepts can be used in a typical project environment. This meant things like using PERT, using CPM, using work breakdown structures, using a whole lot of network theory. All the basic concepts of project management as we know today were being designed, conceptualized, developed, and looked at for implementing in the real world. So this was one of the thrust areas. And these areas and these tools and techniques, they got evolved over a period of time, and practitioners came together across various countries and they tried to define what we call global standards. So there was a move towards trying to integrate the experiences of various practitioners from different parts of the world and seeing how a global standard could be created and developed. Now, this also meant that they were trying to look at what could be the possible best practices in the area of project management. So best practices were being defined, global standards were being defined. So as the processes were being defined and the best practices were being defined, the first generation had its clear focus, which was essentially process. And the objective was to disseminate knowledge, disseminate understanding of project management, and this was meant to be through the use of best practices and global standards. The key was on acknowledging a specific process and the thrust was on implementing it. So like I said, the thrust was to understand how to implement a particular project, and therefore the objectives of the thrust was to ensure that they are easy to understand, they are easy to use, they are easy to adopt, and they are easy to be audited. So easy usage, adoption, implementation, and audit. These were the basic focus areas or the thrust which was being given at that particular time. In other words, project management was being mapped into a series of standard operating procedures, very similar to operations. So while this school recognized project management to be a separate faculty, it did integrate project management thinking much in line with the operations management thinking in defining and developing standard operating procedures and ensuring that these standard operating procedures are going to be used. So therefore, the idea of changing this process, because once you define a standard, once you define the best practice, the understanding also is that you don't have to change the process. So the scope for changing the process was very little in this first generation, and essentially they believed that they had this magic mantra, the magic mantra of having the best practices. Therefore, the first generation definitely said, we don't want to change it, you just have to implement it. So it was intrinsically a compliance oriented generation. So the idea was to ensure compliance to the best practices and standards. This generation has been prominent over the past few years. In fact, evolved versions of this generation are seen in many of the prominent certifications that are being used today. So if you look at some of the prominent certifications, you will see they are all process centric, they all have their own framework, they are all compliance oriented. The focus was essentially on terminology, the focus was on processes, and the focus was on basic methods. And these certifications are also going along the same direction. So coming back to the topic of our discussion, unfortunately both project delays and cost overruns continued to plague the industry. So while we said that we have found the magic mantra of best practices, it was also observed that these practices were not good enough for the industry and time and cost overruns were plenty and abundant. Therefore, they were not able to add value beyond spreading basic awareness in project management. The limited success of the first generation in solving practical problems gave impetus to fresh research in the area of project management and trying to understand how these techniques could be further evolved and improved. In the early 90s, therefore, a new generation of project management was introduced. This was with the genesis of agile methods and iterative models in project management. What actually meant was that the practitioner went for a more dynamic process than what was being laid out in the first generation. It also meant that the second generation had come in a big way, and it had come with a paradigm shift from generic project management. Now the second generation was talking more about areas which are more specialized. So specialized project management became the order of the day. And these were therefore advanced process frameworks. So the orientation here was on skilling or skill development, trying to understand how skill has to be developed in a project scenario over what we knew earlier as the knowledge development, which was the thrust in the first generation. Therefore, the specialization actually came in the form of specific process models. Now, these specific process models were essentially looking at speed and efficiency, and they were looking at understanding certain constraints which are typical in specific environments. So the developments of this generation could therefore be termed as the development of the non-generic methods of project management, non-generic tools of project management, and non-generic techniques of project management, and methods which were to be used for a particular application only. The key attribute was therefore making and or developing a process sequence and a life cycle which would be suitable for a specific environment. Again, the thrust had been on implementing these processes or these process sequences with marginal flexibility. So the flexibility component which was missing in the first generation continued in the second generation because they were looking at more evolved but process models nevertheless, and each process model had these problems. Most importantly, in the second generation also, there was no specific focus on inline optimization, which meant that during the course of the project manager was not given adequate freedom and flexibility to make changes. Therefore, he could not go in and optimize the methodology during the course of the project. Most iterative and agile methods aimed at trying to share the ownership of the project between the stakeholders. So they were also aiming at educating stakeholders about the nuances in the project scenarios with changing or unclear scope. So essentially these were trying to share the ownership and share the methodology and the nuances associated with such a methodology in various forms. And like the first generation, the second generation too was a process-centric model. So essentially it was a process-oriented model which we saw, and their objective was again on improving efficiency. So we see how the first generation and second generation did change. So we had this efficiency issue, and we had an understanding of how the process-centric nature was there. Again, this generation has been immensely popular. In fact, you will find a lot of implementations of this method even today. But the trends are showing a diminishing value, because most of the project issues which we had in the past, which included time overruns, cost overruns, and scope control, they continued even with the second generation. So while the second generation or specialized models were popular, they did have their problems, and replicating the second generation was a problem across environments. It was not too encouraging for industry. These trends therefore paved the way to look at specific innovations in project management. So in the year 2016, a new approach was formally introduced in the market. This approach is the third generation of project management, and it is called a forward-looking approach to project management. The key focus of this generation is the framework for management decision making that is central and primal to the project manager. This generation looks at processes as subordinate to management decision making. So while this generation also emphasizes the utilization of knowledge, the emphasis is that utilization goes beyond the process. So you might have a process which is right, but despite having the right process, the utilization of knowledge may not be achieved. Therefore, it recognizes that the same process cannot achieve the same result in all types of environments. So this variability is something which is appreciated in this third generation project management approach. The third generation identifies the importance of differentiating past data, available information, and looks at analytics-based information. So what data is available and how the analytics can be used using modeling and simulation. And modeling and simulation as the key tools, they try to understand and recognize how these processes and how these data and the models can influence decision making. Therefore, various factors are considered and decision making is looked at in the broader context. The core is to have a flexible process. Like I said, the first generation was all about process. The second generation was again about process. In this generation, we are talking about a flexible approach, which we say is flexible to the process, and the variability is not random. It's not ad hoc like what was in the earlier generations. Rather, the variability in the process is something that is very well defined, and the guiding principles are laid out in the decision making framework. And these robust principles are a part of this new conceptual framework that allows the project manager to move from parametric to probabilistic to deterministic course of decision making. So fundamentally, it covers the entire gamut of the project environments through its decision making framework. The forward looking approach incorporates not just changing scopes, but also changing considerations. And while doing so, it incorporates performance variabilities and leverages from performance drivers using systems thinking and design thinking. And these are implemented using modeling and simulation methods. Therefore, you see a whole lot of build-up in this particular approach. And this approach provides for inline optimization as the project moves forward. It basically allows that because it doesn't promote any standard process methodology. Process is flexible, process is variable. So unlike the previous generations, the belief is that over standardization of a process is dangerous. For example, project managers are well aware that project reports are often fudged because the way people work and they know how the standard process works. So they know how to work around this process and fetch the reports. So standard reports, standard process, standard formats, all these are dangerous because they will lead to inaccurate reporting. And this approach actually looks at that. So the forward-looking approach provides for assessment and decision frameworks for various project contexts to arrive at optimal direction and course of action. Most of the approaches are based on a postmodern view. Basically, after doing a project, you start evaluating what was done right and what was done wrong. The forward-looking approach is different. It talks about where you are and where you want to go. It doesn't talk about a postmodern. So in doing so, you need a very robust mechanism. And this forward-looking approach is the only methodology today that emphasizes and provides a tool to explicitly link the strategy to operations in a project. Thus, it is far more powerful and has far-reaching consequences. The thrust is on being outcome-oriented both at the strategic as well as the tactical and the functional level. The third generation is going to be a breakthrough in project implementation. It has been successfully tested in numerous projects, and it is going to be bringing in a new wave of project management products that would enable better success to all stakeholders. To learn more about this, please get in touch with us at www.consultingconnoisseurs.com. However, before I wind up, I need to emphasize one particular aspect, that the third generation is actually one which will leverage new technologies, for instance those of data analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning and deep learning. So fundamentally, even when we go for an artificial neural network model, it might make the traditional project manager redundant. However, our tools are way above and at the forefront of research, and therefore our tools are able to ensure a long-term sustainability of the project manager's value that he needs to add to his organization and the way in which he would add.
To learn more on how it should be implemented in your company, please visit our website www.consultingconnoisseurs.com or email us at info@consultingconnoisseurs.com.